Hello and welcome to my kitchen here at Trails End 62. Going to be visiting today something that I've done in the past. Burritos in a jar. Been a couple of years since I did this, and like everything in life, things change. You learn new things, you keep going, you find different ways to do things, you find easier ways, and things just change. And one of the things that's changed for me is, of course, I got married to Evie, and she's from Belize, and she has introduced me to a whole different cuisine than what I'm used to for Latin America. Mostly as what can I say, I'm a gringo. My experience with Mexican food is northern Mexican food, but like other places in the world, when I lived in Spain, for instance, paella along the coast is done with seafood. But paella on the plateau is not done with seafood. They don't have any seafood there. It's done with chicken and sausage, chorizo, things like that. So different regions of a country have different ways of doing things. The same thing here in the United States. There are different ways of preparing things depending on what part of the country you're from. So one of the things I learned, I always thought tacos, burritos, all that kind of stuff was ground meat, ground beef. Pork is a wonderful alternative. People do chicken, and one thing that I never thought that I would do, fish empanadas. Anyway, so I'm going to be doing my burritos in a jar with pork. Now, the reason is because I have a bunch of pork that I have left over from making some more tamale meat, which is pork and chicken or pork and turkey mixed together. And I made just finished a bunch of tamale meat, so I had some pork left over, so I'm going to can up some burritos in a jar using pork rather than ground beef like I used before. It's done a little bit different, and I'm going to probably be revisiting some things that I've done in the past, different ways and techniques, things that I've learned through the process. You're never too old to learn. I learn every day. Been in this for 50 years canning, and I learn every day something new when I get to canning, because there's always something different to learn. And sometimes, and I know this is hard to believe, but sometimes your way isn't the best way. My way isn't the best way. If you learn a different way, that's better. Be flexible. Keep learning. So anyway, I'm going to be doing pork in my burritos in a jar, and I'm going to be doing them in 1.5-pint jars this time instead of pints, because I did them in pints before. It was just me. But with the two of us, I'll do them in 1.5 pints, and it'll be so what I'll be putting in will be a little different. The recipe is still going to be for pints. You just double it for quarts. You third it, increase it by a third. No, you increase it by a half more of what you're putting in for 1.5 pints, because you're doing a pint plus a half a pint. So you increase it by half much more. But I'm going to be giving the recipe for a pint. I don't want to confuse you, okay? Pints. Most people do pints and quarts. But for a pint, that's pretty basic, all right? So I'll be giving the recipe for a pint, but I'm actually going to be doing 1.5 pints. So don't be confused, because I know sometimes I'm easily confused about these things, but don't be confused. So 1.5 pints, and I'll be giving you the recipe for pints. And it's basically the same as my other burritos in a jar. Mostly it's a little bit different technique, because the meat I'm going to be using is raw pork. In the other burritos in a jar, it was ground beef, which was par cooked. It doesn't give out as much liquid as raw pork will. So we're going to make an adjustment there and how we put it into the jar. So we're getting everything ready here, and we're ready to start putting our ingredients in the jar. You put them in a layer, and you put them in the order that's set on the recipe. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put in 1/4 cup of beans. Now you can use black beans or you can use pinto beans. I'm using pinto beans. I've used black beans before. but I'm going to be putting 1/4 of a cup per pint. So for 1.5 pints, I'm going to use 3/8. Now, once we have our beans in, then we are going to put in some beef broth to cover the beans. And the reason we do this is so that we're able to get the beans and all the air pockets out of there. We don't want to seal any air pockets in there, so we're going to put the beef broth in. You know, we're going to fill it up a little more, but to cover the beans good, and that way we can be sure and get them all covered. Next, normally we would put in the meat, but since we're using raw meat, and you can use beef, chicken, pork, we're going to be using pork. We're going to wait till last to put that in, because the raw meat, we're going to put it in raw, we're not par cooking it or anything. It will generate its own juices. So we won't need as much beef broth to fill these up as we did with the hamburger. So we're going to be putting in our meat in last. Normally you would go ahead and put your meat in now and then finish it up, but we're going to put the other stuff in first and put our meat in last, because we'll just fill our broth up to the top of everything else, and then the meat won't have any broth covering it because it'll generate its own juices. So next we have our onions and peppers. Now we're going to be doing, for the pint, it is 1/4 cup of each onions and peppers. Since we have 1.5 pints, we're going to be doing 3/8. Again, 3/8 cups per 1.5 pints, so 1/4 cup of onions and peppers per pint. Now I'm going to be using some habanero powder that I made with my fresh habaneros from the garden to spice this up a little bit. If you want to put some jalapeno peppers in here with these peppers, you can mix your jalapenos in here or habaneros in here or whatever spicy peppers you want in with your peppers. These are all green peppers that I'm using. Now next we're going to be putting in some, the original recipe for this calls for rotel tomatoes. I use my chunky tomato salsa. So it's going to be 2 tablespoons per pint of rotel tomatoes, or I use my chunky tomato salsa. You can use any kind of chunky tomato salsa you want. If you want to do that, that's fine. It just adds a little bit of that flavor in there. And so this will be 2 tablespoons per pint, so 3 tablespoons for 1.5 pints. Next I'm going to put in some taco seasoning. Now you can make your own taco seasoning if you want. I didn't. So I'm going to be putting in, it'd be 1/2 tablespoon per pint. And then I'm going to be adding, normally you would add salt, but my beef broth is pretty salty. So I'm not going to add any salt. It's 1/2 teaspoon per quart, so it'll be 1/4 teaspoon per pint if you want to add salt. But test your beef broth first, because it may be salty enough. If it's pretty salty, or if it's salty enough, you don't need to add any extra salt. Salt is just for taste, has nothing to do with the canning process. Now I'm going to be adding my habanero powder, and it's about 1/8 teaspoon per pint, and this just gives it just a little bit of heat. If you want more, you can put more in, or you can just make it this way and then add the heat as you cook it to make it as hot as you want. And that way you can always have some for those who don't want the heat. So I'll be adding just a little bit over 1/8 teaspoon per 1.5 pints, but it's 1/8 teaspoon per pint of my habanero powder. that I made with, I dried my habaneros from the garden on my dehydrator, and then I crushed them up into a powder. And I'm going to add, as you can see, it's probably a little dry, so I'm going to add a little bit of more beef broth to cover the ingredients that are in there. So with the ingredients that are in there and the beef broth, we're going to bring it up to about half full. So it'll be the same with the pint, be half full, pint and a half, we're bringing it half full, and then we'll put our meat in. Now, like I said, this is going to be pork cut up into chunks. And we're going to be using about a cup of meat per pint and a half, which would be 3/4 a cup per pint. So we're going to be using just a little bit over a cup. Now I'm going to finish adding meat to it, so I bring it up to 1-inch headspace. Alright, and there we have it. Now I'm going to wipe my rims, and as you probably can see right here, I got some stuff on the rim right there, so I'm going to have to wipe them real good, clean them off, put my lids on, put them in my canners. My canners, my Nesco canners, will do 5 pint and a halves each, just like it'll do 5 pints. So it's kind of tight, but it will do it just like it'll do 5 wide mouth pints. It'll do 5 pint and a halves. These are also wide mouths. And so I'll put 5 in each one, and I will can them at the quart time, which is 90 minutes. Pint time is 75 minutes. That's the meat. And we'll see how it goes from there. Burritos in a jar. Very important to wipe your rims and clean them off so there's nothing on the rim that will keep it from sealing. So once they're all wiped down and dried off, then I put my lids on, and then rings finger tight. Alright, now we're ready to go. Now these are not hot, but they're not cold. The meat was cold, the broth that I put in was hot, so they're kind of lukewarm. So when I put my water in my canner, I'm going to put hot water, but not really hot water, just barely hot water, because, well, if you put cold water in there, if you have a cold jar, you really want cold water in there so your jars don't crack. Unless your jars are really cold, which I do not recommend, then you don't want really cold water in your canners. Lukewarm water will suffice. So I would recommend at least lukewarm water, even if your jars are cool or cold, room temperature, that sort of thing. But you don't want to put hot water in there in cold jars, and so you don't want to put hot jars in cold water. So your water needs to be hot, your jars need to be hot. In this case, my jars are basically room temperature with the hot broth and the cold meat mixed in there together, so they're basically room temperature. So I'm going to put not hot, but more than warm water in the canners, because that way they'll work better and more efficiently and faster. So we'll put that in. I put my vinegar in there. We'll put these in, we'll time them and get them set to go. Well, there we are. Got 10 pint and a halves of burritos in a jar with pork. I wanted to mention something here that I talked about. I did 5, I can fit 5 pint and a halves in my Nesco canner, but let me point this out. Because I do it, I have to be real careful, and anytime you do this you have to be real careful, because the gasket fits on the inside here when you close the lid. The gasket rim fits on the inside of this, and if you're not careful with 5 of those in here, I wouldn't recommend you do it unless you be real careful, because with 5 of those in there it makes it real tight. against the rim, and you got to get this gasket down between the rim and the jars or it's not going to seal. And I had to work with one of these when it was going because it wasn't sealing. I had leakage around the edge because the gasket wasn't where it should be, and I had to work it in there where it was. So 4 pint and a half, just like 4 quarts. Just do 4 in there, and then you have no problem whatsoever. If you try to do 5 like I did, you might run into a little bit of problem because, like I said, this rim has to go down on the inside, and when you have 5 pint and a halves in here, it is real tight around the edges. And there you have it, my burritos in a jar with pork rather than ground beef. Basically the same, a little bit different on how you put it in there. Going to enjoy these on the winter coming months. That's it. From my house to your house. From my kitchen to your kitchen. God bless.